It's just a hat. Why can't I get it to fit? If you've ever felt this way after crocheting a hat, I first want to say you are not alone. If you have never felt this way after crocheting a hat, count your blessings. It's a miracle. Crocheting a hat feels like a simple task, but can be surprisingly difficult. Hello. I am Sarah Korth of SEK Handmade, and I'm super excited to be talking to you today about how to crochet a hat that fits. Today, we're going to be covering what's the problem? Why is it so hard to get a crochet hat that fits nicely? And what are some solutions so that you can successfully make crochet hats? All right, so let's start off by talking about what is the problem? Why is it so hard? I think the number one reason we find crocheting hats that fit to be incredibly difficult is our perception. I want you to think about it. Before you knew that handmade hats existed, what was your experience with hats? Obviously, it's store-bought hats, right? If you can't be the recipient or make a handmade hat yourself, the other solution is going to the store and buying a hat. Did you know that crochet cannot be done by machine? That's why whenever you go to a store, everything you find is knit. If you've never seen a knitting machine work, go search out a video. It is fascinating. So likely every hat you have purchased before you knew handmade hats existed were knitted hats. And here's where the problem lies. That means that all of our assumptions about hats come from a different craft. A yarn craft, yes, but the way that knitting is formed causes the fabric to be way stretchier. More stretchy? Either way. Knitted hats stretch a lot more than crocheted hats, especially those simple ones you find in the store where it's just the knit stitches over and over and over again. Those have a lot of stretch to them. So we go into making our crocheted hats thinking they should look and feel a lot like a knitted hat, and as long as we stick with that, we should be good to go. The tricky part is the way that crocheted stitches are formed makes them, generally speaking, less stretchy. So if you end up with a hat that looks a lot like what you expect a hat to look like, the likelihood that that hat is also not going to fit your head like you expect is pretty good. The second problem is that I don't think we think about hats fitting until we make a hat that doesn't fit. Everybody knows that you need a bust size, a waist size, a length in a pants, that those are all different on people, but we don't think about the fact that people have different head sizes. One time I had a tester work on a pattern. She crocheted it up and it looked great. But she messaged me saying she was frustrated because the hat didn't fit her. The very first thing I asked was, "Have you measured your head?" And she said no. So I suggested that she go ahead and measure her head. Unfortunately, that is when she found out that her head was significantly larger than what the hat size was intended to fit. That is not something you want to find out after you have made yourself a whole hat. This also spirals back into all of our store-bought hats being knit hats, because you'll find them to be one size fits all, and that is again because they can stretch a whole lot, and so one size does fit almost everybody. Since crocheted hats are lacking that additional stretch, you're going to have to get a lot closer to fitting your actual head size if your crochet hat is going to fit. All right, enough chit chat about the problems. Let's talk solutions. The very first thing I want you to do to make a hat that actually fits, you can probably guess, is measure your head. So let's talk about how to get some measurements from your head or from the head of somebody else you're going to make a hat for. That person's so lucky. Obviously, since we're measuring around something round, we're going to need a flexible tape measure. The first thing I want you to think about is, how do you like to wear your hats? It makes sense to measure your head in the direction that you wear your hat. So if you're a person who wears a hat straight around your head, like this, measure straight around your head. I personally prefer to have my hats sit low on the back of my head and then come up high to the top of my head. So I'm going to want to measure my head in that direction. That measurement around your head is going to be the circumference of your hat. The next thing you want to know is how tall you want your hat to be. For that, I'm going to measure from the crown of my head to the bottom of my ear because I live in a place that's really cold and I want my hat to cover the bottom of my ears. One of the things I've learned through designing is that the Craft Yarn Council, which a lot of people follow their standards, say that the average head size for a woman is between 21 and 23 inches in circumference. That would be 53 to 58.5 centimeters. Also, a standard height for hat is 9 inches. The other thing that I've learned in designing hats is that I have a child-sized head. While my head circumference is pretty average, I have a shorter head, and so I need more like 8 inches to get a really good fit. So what that means is now that I have the knowledge of how my head fits into the standard size measurements, I can make adjustments so that I can either find patterns that are more suited for my head size or make adjustments to patterns so that I get a fit that fits me really nicely. Another way to get a good fit as far as height of a hat is to go ahead and get out a hat that you really love. This could be a store-bought hat or a handmade hat, and measure from the top of the hat to the brim of the hat and see what that depth is, and then aim for that when you make your own hats. Do not do this with circumference though, because especially if it's a knit hat, it's going to be a lot more narrow because of that stretch that knit stitches have. The second step to getting a hat that you're really gonna love and fits well is you need to check out your pattern. Not all pattern designers make their hats in the same finished measurements. You may find that some people aim straight for the middle. Some people are aiming for the Craft Yarn Council standards. Some people make hats that fit their heads best. So looking at the finished measurements of each pattern can help you decide, is this a pattern that's going to just fit me really well? Or is this a pattern that I might have to modify some so that I get the best fit possible? Once you made that decision, then of course you need to decide, how easy is it going to be for me to modify this hat if that's the direction you chose? If you decide that you're going to need to modify the pattern, another step along the way then is to look at the pattern carefully and decide, how easy is it going to be for you to modify that pattern so that you can get a really good fit? For some patterns, that's going to be easy peasy, and for other patterns, it could be a real challenge. The great news about yarn is once you've started a project, it's not done and has to be thrown away if some mistakes are made. You can always tear it back and try again. You just need to decide how much time and patience do you have for that modification and try again sort of process. When you're looking at the finished measurements of a hat and comparing it to your head circumference especially, I want to talk real quick about ease. Ease is the difference between the finished measurement of a project and your physical body. So let's say, for instance, that your head is a 20-inch circumference. You're looking at a pattern. The pattern has an 18-inch finished circumference. That means that that pattern has -2 inches of ease. The hat is 2 inches smaller than your body. If again your head is 20 inches and the finished measurements of the hat are 22 inches, that means that the hat has 2 inches of positive ease, which means that the hat is 2 inches larger than the measurement of your head. Why is this important? Because you're probably going to want a hat that is in a range of 1 inch from your head circumference. Which means, again, if your head is 20 inches, if a finished circumference is 19 inches, 20 inches, or 21 inches, you're probably going to be okay. Part of what makes this a little tricky, though, is that different stitches have different amounts of stretch. So as you crochet along, you're going to kind of want to see, how much stretch does my fabric have? Another thing that you're going to want to be aware of in making a hat that's going to fit you really well is the fiber content of your yarn. Different fiber contents stretch in different ways. Generally speaking, Plant fibers like linen, bamboo, cotton have less stretch, while animal fibers like wool, alpaca, and yak tend to have more stretch to them. The tricky part again is that within all of those fiber contents, there can be a mix of things, whether it's a mix of plant fibers and animal fibers, or a mix of man-made fibers and plant or animal fibers, and the way that they're processed can make a difference on the amount of stretch they have. So I'm going to tell you something you don't want to hear. It might not hurt to make a little swatch and just see how stretchy is that fabric. Speaking of swatches, you're not going to want to hear this one either. Probably the most important part of getting a hat that fits is becoming a master of gauge. Now, I know that a lot of people who are newer to crochet have never even heard of gauge, and that those who are maybe a little more experienced have come to despise gauge. I totally get it. Gauge can be a complicated thing. Very simply put, gauge is just a comparison of the size of the stitches that the designer created in their pattern and the size of the stitches that you're making. Having a gauge that is off significantly is probably the number one reason your hat is not fitting. Probably the number one way to get a hat that is not going to fit would be to throw gauge out the window and just see what happens. Here's the problem though. If your stitches are a significantly different size than the designer's stitches, then your hat is also going to be a very significantly different size. So even if you've measured your head and you know that the finished item should fit you, if you create a finished item with different size stitches, it's still not going to fit. Gauge is a really in-depth topic, and so I'm not going to go super deep into it here, but I am going to recommend that you gauge swatch for your hats, or at the very least, keep track of it as you're crocheting. Speaking of keeping track of it while you're crocheting, I also want to encourage you that as you crochet your hat, you should stop every once in a while and lay your hat on a flat surface and check your progress. Even if you made a gauge swatch that was spot on, when it comes time to actually crochet the hat, your gauge might change a little bit. So taking the time after you've crocheted several inches of your hat to lay it down on a table and take your tape measure and just double check to see what's the diameter of your hat. Remember, that's going to be half the circumference. So don't lay it down and be like, 10 inches, ah! If you're aiming for a 20-inch circumference, 10 inches is spot on. I may or may not have done that in the past. Then also just check the depth of your hat to make sure you're on the right track. The more you check in with the size of hat that you're making as you are making it, the more likely you are to end up with a hat you really love. My last suggestion to you is to expect a square hat. When I first started crocheting hats, I thought they were all wrong because they all looked short and stumpy. The thing is, there was nothing wrong with my crocheted hats. There was something wrong with the assumptions in my head about what a hat should look like. They again were all based on knitted hats, which were tall and skinny. And so my hats that were more square just looked wrong to me. But since there's not as much stretch in the circumference of a crocheted hat, you need to have the finished measurement of that hat be a lot closer to your head size than you do with a knitted hat. So just know in your brain that that hat is probably going to look a lot more square than you're expecting it to. Here's the thing. Nobody's going to see it laying flat on a table like you are. And once it goes on your head, if it fits, it'll be gorgeous. Okay, now that you are going to have mastered crochet hats that fit really well, I hope you go bonkers and crochet all the hats. I know that's kind of a weird thing to say when in the United States where I am, it's spring, but I want to give a little plug for crocheting hats all summer long. Here's my argument for why you should crochet hats in the summer. 1, it's a small project, which means you don't have big, heavy, warm things laying on your body. As you're crocheting a hat, it's just hanging from your hands and it's not going to make you hot. It being small means it's portable. We got lots of things to do in the summer. We're not just sitting in our corner and crocheting things. We got to be out and about, and a hat is easy to take along with you. The lazy days of summer are a great time to learn new skills, and a hat is a great way to try out some new stitches and learn some new skills. So now that I've convinced you that summer's a great time to make hats, and that you know how to make awesome hats that fit, my final great reason for crocheting hats all summer long is fall will sneak up on you, and you can have a hat for everyone you love by the time fall comes around. Hats are also a really great thing to go all in on because there are lots of people who need a warm, cozy hat. So check out your area for places to donate hats. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that all of these tips and tricks help you to make hats that you love and fit you really well. Have an amazing time crocheting hats, and happy crafting!